recording that you attended the conference session in Brisbane at Open Education Global. So I think you have a bit of an insight into the kind of questions that we're going to ask today. It's a semi-structured interview, so we're free to talk around things, and I might ask you some follow-up questions. Altogether, I have 10 questions to get through. But as we go through the conversation, we may cover some of this stuff as we go, so we might not need to ask all 10 of those as they're written down. Thank you very much for taking part in this. Just to get us started, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your current role?
Sure. My name is Curt Newton. I'm currently director of MIT OpenCourseWare. I've worked with the program. I joined up in 2004, so entering my 21st year with it. I've been director for about 5 years in that position. I, sort of provide overall general managerial support for the whole team and put a lot of attention on the sort of broader strategic direction. And so what's going on with AI is close to home, should I say.
That's great, thank you. And could you say just a little bit about MIT Open and the kind of initiatives that you have going on there?
Yeah, so MIT OpenCourseWare launched in 2001 with a sort of a twofold mission. First off, I think we were the first large institution to get into with a really sort of intentional, broad-based, let's publish everything we can from the curriculum, anywhere in the world. And so there was I'd say a sprint of sorts for those first few years to share materials from across the MIT curriculum and, kind of figure out what that meant, starting from the sort of just kind of initial inclination that knowledge should be free and we should do everything in our capacity to bring that to bear. That was, one part of the mission. The second part of the mission was to help launch the movement because, there were some really great projects, on kind of a smaller scale distributed around the world. How could we pull people together and build some momentum and build some alignment? And so after, beginning to share the materials from the MIT curriculum freely online, framed as here's what was taught in the classroom at MIT, starting to pull together, what has become Open Education Global was a kind of a second part of the mission. We've, it's been thrilling to see the growth of that movement and kind of hand that off to the consortium and see the amazing things that have developed. Meanwhile, at home at OCW, we're still pretty true to that original mission, which is primarily what we're doing is working with faculty on a voluntary basis to share the materials that they have produced for the teaching in the classroom. And we extend and stretch beyond that a little bit, to, occasionally roll up our sleeves and do things that are a little bit more fit for a specific purpose of how might these materials be used online. But that's still true to the mission.
Thank you. Yeah, it's MIT's had such a central role in leading the open education movement through these initiatives. It's pretty crazy to think it's almost 25 years old now. OCW. It kind of makes me feel old, but
yeah, here's that.
So obviously things have changed a bit since 2001. In terms of your current kind of thinking, how do you understand AI and what kind of AI tools are you looking at, using, experimenting with, and how do you sort of understand AI in your role?
Yeah, the primary thing that has our attention these days is AI as a sort of intermediary or advisor or concierge, if you will, for how people discover knowledge and find their way through all of these materials. I know it's important to note that OpenCourseWare is sort of its uses are split across people who are attached to educational institutions. About half of our use, as we understand it, comes from students and educators, and the other half comes from independent learners. And so, working across that breadth of use cases is really fascinating and a great challenge, but one that we're very invested in. And So especially thinking about those independent learners who are, trying to find their way. Um, for many years, things like Google search have helped people find their way into our collection, and we see AI, you know, becoming uh, a new sort of broker and intermediary into the knowledge commons. And so, having that work in an effective, functional way, I'd say is the key thing. So building AI tools into the, search and discovery and pathfinding functionalities on our website and our, sort of broader properties is a key thing. People talk about, an AI assisted TA or, something like that, typically. So I'd say that's the top of mind thing. I mean, we're also aware of the roles that AI can play in producing producing open education resources itself. And there, the top thing in my mind is um, how to adapt from a starting point to make the material match where any learner is currently at. And so that might take the form of language translations. It might take the form of um, storing up prerequisite knowledge so they can, then jump in on the source materials. Other forms of localization feel a particularly rich space to be working. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. So it sounds like you're looking at AI tools now as a way of kind of addressing sort of long-standing issues around sort of unsupported content, right? If you're just putting out, here's a course, anyone can kind of work their way through these materials. You're looking at these tools as ways to help people navigate that, to personalize their learning, and then also from the point of view of a tool to create OERs as well.
Yeah.
What kind of, are there any specific technologies that you're looking at or around AI? Or I guess one thing I'm wondering from your answer is, you could say, well, in a way, this is just what you've been using software for a long time, and these are just the latest versions of these tools. Or is there something sort of qualitatively different around AI that you're interested in?
I'm not sure if it's qualitatively different or just there's been such an acceleration in the capacity of these tools that it feels like we've hit a tipping point. But when I think about language translations, for instance, it feels like, um, the automated language translations of a couple of years ago, were worse. And now, while they're still not perfect, they're good enough, and I'm relying heavily on, on contacts with people who are deep into the weeds on these things, and what they're reporting to me is, yeah, we're kind of there, So, for instance, we've been involved the past couple of months with a community who's using AI to assist in translating some MIT OpenCourseWare materials into Ukrainian to bring them into the hands of motivated high school students, and they're using AI plus their own custom tuned glossary on a course by course basis or topic by topic basis to make it work even better. It's like, yeah, they're able to crank these things out, in good time. And so I don't think that was possible a couple of years ago.
So it's a kind of paradigm change for you.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I think that paradigm change is kind of in that aggregate, just because the sort of theoretical capabilities that we've known about that have been floating around, people have been experimenting with, have just sort of hit a point where they're kind of on the cusp of good enough now with some, again, we we have to get in there and continue to do some fine tuning and some quality assurance checks and such. But yeah, we're kind of on that edge right now.
Okay, great. So thinking now about more on the open education side of things, can you just maybe say a bit, you already gave us a little bit of a sort of spoiler alert with your sort of general introduction, but what's your experience with open education, and what does open education mean to you?
Yeah, fundamentally, it's that, you know, you know, knowledge should be free, and we're much better off when it is, with a few, bounds and parameters on it. For instance, the growing awareness of other knowledge practices, indigenous knowledge practices, and the care that they are bringing to who and how and when some things are shared, has really, really stuck with me, and I think about a lot in some of the spheres that I work in around, say, climate and sustainability. Feels really, really important. Um, but along with that, sort of general knowledge should be free. That um, that's that's a necessary but not sufficient step to reach the sort of broader goal of, you know, people should be able to be empowered to connect, with equity and inclusion, to connect into these things. And so the practices of open pedagogy and such that connect into the sort of what we're sharing, are a really important component as well. So those things are, they sort of fuel each other. They're complementary.
And just to be clear, what does MIT OpenCourseWare do?
What do we do?
Yeah.
Like, so we share materials that are created by the MIT community. That includes faculty, but also student contributions, their project work, and so forth. And we've always done that from before the term open pedagogy was floating around out there. It's like, oh yeah, oh wow, we're doing that too. um, and also, coming in strong, I'd say over the last 10 years, in addition to sharing these materials, the what we're teaching, the knowledge we're sharing out, some of the how and why, in the form of working with faculty to have them tell their stories of pedagogy and practice, and that's woven in there as well.
That's great, thank you. So bearing in mind your kind of perspective on AI, perspective on open, how would you define openness in the context of AI in education?
Yeah, well, top of mind for us at the moment has to do with kind of traceability, attribution. Um, I think anybody who's spent time in the outputs of, say, chat style AI models, knows that um, they will make connections that aren't necessarily solid, in their pattern matching and recognition. And so the ability to have traceability back into the source, I feel like, is really essential to build the sort of capability for discernment, which is I think a key learning objective for all learners, now 2025 going forward. We got to be able to track back to the source. And so, I'm glad to see, for instance, if I ask Chat GPT, why is linear algebra important? And it gives me an answer and say, oh, that sounds pretty cool. How should I go about learning linear algebra? And then it gives me some suggestions for different types of things, including, like links to Gil Strang's materials on MIT OpenCourseWare that are, here, check this out. So it's like a, sort of enhanced interface. And, if if the learner goes down that path in the dialogue with the chatbot, yeah, you can track back to it. Boiling that up just a little bit, when I see the way AI is driving Google search right now, and it's, top of the search result, sort of synthesis of the information, that's a little trickier, Yeah, it can track it back to the source, but it's currently expressing those answers with a definitiveness that I don't think is quite warranted. I've had some of those experiences in my personal life trying to use those search tools recently. Yeah, we still have some work to do.
Yeah, thank you. So are there any specific sort of AI tools that you've been using, or you mentioned around sort of brokering, I guess you could call it sort of communication or tutorial support. But then there's also this idea of creation tools. Are they, these translation tools? I understand if it's a trade secret or something, but if there are specific kind of software that you would consider to be on the open end of things that you're using.
I'm sort of beyond my expertise. I'm not as plugged in and grounded in specific tools.
Sure.
I look to others on my team to recommend things for that. I mean, I'll say, personally on the open end of things, I mean, a huge amount of my personal work in this space is driven by bringing open practices more effectively into our collective work on climate and sustainability. And there's an open source spirited tool called Climate GPT, which I'm very keen to see how that develops. But that's I'll say that's a sort of a bias lean. That's not MIT OpenCourseWare speaking. That's Curt Newton speaking.
For sure. Yeah, no worries. So it sounds like you're sort of maybe a bit more focused on the sort of open practice side than open source software, for instance. Is that a fair summary? Or?
Yeah. And I have colleagues at MIT who are more into the
software side
tools
of
and the practices, and I'm glad to have them as my colleagues. All that. Yeah.
And obviously, there are aspects of openness in both the technologies and the human networks, or the human side of things. Do you consider openness to be something that arises from between those two things through the interaction, or is it something more to do with the humans and how they behave, or is it a feature of the technology, or how do you see it?
I'm not sure. Could you roll that out again?
Yeah, sure. So so on the one hand, you could say, look, these technologies are open. They're open source software, for instance, which is the move that OpenAI and people like them would make and say, look, of course we're open. Look, we're using open source, which kind of overlooks the fact that like 95% of all software that's being used is open source, Linux-based servers and all that sort of thing. But you've also spoken about the sort of open pedagogy, open practices side of things, and so their openness seems to be about what people do rather than the technologies themselves or the licenses that are on the content or anything like that. So my question is really about like, where do you see the balance here? Does the open aspect arise from the tools and technologies? Does it arise from the practices and the values, or is it some combination of those? And just how do you see that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the open tools are a necessary, but in no way sufficient. Part of it. We need those things working together. We learned pretty early on in the OpenCourseWare movement that you can't just build it and assume that all the things that you're hoping for will come to pass. So we need the cultures of open to continue to drive the practices. And for the foreseeable future, we are humans and cultures who are interacting with these things.
Thank you. Yeah. And are there particular characteristics or properties that you sort of associate with being open? You mentioned traceability, capability for discernment. One sort of vector here that made me think around was what they call explicable AI. So the idea that you make it as sort of understandable and maybe as transparent as possible in terms of what's happening. Does that resonate, or are there other things that you think about? Or
yeah, that's very much so. When you're in dialogue with somebody trying to understand something, you should never just take what that first answer is face value if you want to understand it depth. So like, well, why do you think that? Tell me how you came to that. That's really interesting, right? That's such an important part of this sort of broader process and exercise we're in, because frankly, whatever the answer is and the facts are today, a year from now they're going to be shifting, and so these sort of habits of mind and practices about making things explicable and I don't know, befriending the value of not knowing is just so important in this moment and on going forward. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's talk a bit about the values of openness and kind of how you interpret that. You spoke a bit about traditional knowledge, and open pedagogies and the idea of extending access to educational materials and opportunities as widely as possible. How do you see the values of open education? Or maybe I guess what I'm also interested in is how do they relate to AI and the sort of implementation of AI that you perceive?
Yeah. Well, one thread in this space that's been on my mind lately is in the open world, we talk about scale in these different ways, right? There's the way that open, you know, foster this sort of like global scale of sharing in theory, right? But then also with its practices of adaptation and localization gives us the capacity to, you know, operate at this very sort of like localized human scale. And it's been tough, you know, these first couple of decades of the open movement to connect things together across those scales. And I'm very optimistic about AI as a suite of tools and practices and such to help us be more effective at traversing these different levels of scale. You know, it just, you know, if it's just the humans doing the human work at our human speed, we don't quite seem to be able to work across all these scales. So I'm particularly optimistic for AI to help there.
So it's almost like overcoming the bottleneck of like the limits of human capacity.
Yeah, specifically around adaptation and localization. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, AI, give me the 80% start, and then I'll come in and I'll tweak it from there. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you see the opportunities for open AI in education, if we can call it that? You've mentioned obviously some things already around building capacity, improving certain aspects of what happens around, you know, traceability and transparency and that kind of thing, extending certain values into the educational process. But what's your sort of overall vision for what AI could do for education?
Yeah, thinking I think I'd summarize it at having our, you know, our open knowledge work just be much more effective at meeting everybody where they are and supporting whatever it is that they want to do with it. You know, you know, we've built some just incredible starting points and baseline materials and shown some of the ways that could be possible. And so AI, I think, is just a tool to knit this together and help it work more effectively, more nimbly, and to reach, you know, like it feels like we've achieved maybe 20% of what this stuff could be possible to achieve, and now let's really grow it. Yeah.
So it sounds like it could be a sort of catalyst. Would you put it that way?
Yeah, a catalyst. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I think at this moment, I know we've had to go through a big collective, what the heck is this stuff? And you know, people's we've had to kind of freak out a bit, and you know, the range of directions that people want to go with things. You know, we've got to put all that on the table. I look forward, you know, in the next couple of years, things starting to coalesce a bit, and we can say, okay, yeah, those things are not so much an issue. Here's this thing that we didn't even think about very much, that, wow, we got to pay attention to this, and look at these three things that really seem to be clicking and working effective. Let's start to gel a little bit. I look forward to just the sort of complete utter chaos that maybe has been unleashed recently, you know, starting to settle in a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know how you found it, but for me, even just trying to keep pace with it is like a full-time job. Just trying to sort of stay on top of it, you know, get you know, every day there's new papers, every day there's new blogs and everything. It's just very, very hard to keep pace with.
Yeah. Bless those of you who are taking that on, because I haven't been.
Trying to, yeah, trying to.
So I'm gonna have to exit here.
Okay, right.
Yeah, maybe one last final thing, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So, how would you see the sort of necessary steps that we should take to overcome the main risks and to sort of promote the right sort of concept for openness in AI in education?
Yeah, well, I think there's a really important, necessary piece of work going on, which is like the role that Creative Commons is playing in trying to pull us together around this. We're sort of outside the sort of like legal defined bounds. And so holding the space for the conversation about what are the practices and the expectations that we can count on, right? We need to have some things that we can count on, because it's really inefficient to have everybody kind of going through like trying to imagine this for themselves and try to share it out. That feels like a really necessary and process that's underway right now that I'm glad for. You know, they're calling it preference signaling, you know, goes by other sort of names, but you know, some gelling around, okay, what is it actually going to look like to have traceability, transparency into the sourcing, the attribution side is,
so these are
top of mind, as I said. Yeah.
So these are like intellectual property and fair use issues primarily, right?
Yeah. And then David Wiley talked that webinar that he did last month about looking at the ways that open source models are tuned and weighted. That sort of expertise as a sort of new form, well, a form deserving wider recognition and attention of open sharing, that we would be well advised. You know, all the work that people have done on like concept mapping within a discipline, and let's port that over to some AI model weights and help us find our way through these materials more effectively. I think that'll be really great.
That's great. Thanks so much for your time today. Sorry to eat into your next meeting.
Yeah, that's all right, Rob.
Don't be a stranger. I guess I'll see you in 2026 if we're going there for a conference, if not before.
For sure. Yeah, looking forward to that.
All right. Thanks so much for your time today anyway. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
You bet. Yeah,
Cheers.
very good. Thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye.